Rajagriha, northern India, 483 BCE. Inside a cave carved into a hillside, 500 monks sit in complete silence. Outside, the Buddha's funeral pyre still burns. These monks face an impossible task: 45 years of teaching, thousands of sermons, hundreds of thousands of words, all stored in human memory. No recordings, no notes, no written backup. One monk stands. He begins with the traditional formula, Evam me sutam, thus have I heard. We don't have transcripts of what happened in that cave, but we know the problem they faced. The moment one monk's memory differed from another's, they had a crisis, not of doctrine, of authority. Who decides what the Buddha actually said? This tension planted a seed that would grow for centuries. Within 100 years, monks would be arguing bitterly over whether you could store salt in a cow horn. Within 700 years, new scriptures would appear claiming the Buddha taught profound secrets he never mentioned publicly. Within 1,200 years, practitioners in Tibet would develop intensive methods claiming to compress lifetimes of practice into a single life. Every tradition faces this question eventually. Do you protect the original form, or do you let the form change so the core can survive? In the centuries that followed, different Buddhist communities answered that question in different ways. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand how one teaching became 3 major Buddhist vehicles, and why that fracture might have been the only way Buddhism could survive 2,500 years. When the Buddha died in 483 BCE, he left his followers with a crisis. According to the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, his final instruction was clear. All conditioned things decay. Strive on with diligence. No successor appointed, no hierarchy established, no texts written. The entire Dharma existed in the memories of monks who had heard him teach. Some had been with him for decades. Others had joined weeks before his death. They'd all heard different teachings at different times and in different contexts, and they faced a brutal reality. Memory fades, details shift. Without action, the Buddha's words could scatter into dozens of conflicting versions within a generation. From the very beginning, Buddhism faced a problem every living tradition faces. How do you preserve a teaching without freezing it? Preserve too rigidly, and the teaching hardens into a system that cannot respond to new worlds. The very attachment the Buddha taught people to release. Preserve too loosely, and the teaching begins to drift beyond recognition. This tension would drive every major split in Buddhist history. We're going to trace how Buddhism went from one unified Sangha to 3 distinct vehicles: Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, the traditions you explored in our video on the 3 schools of Buddhism. But this isn't only a story about doctrine, it's also a story about authority, memory, and power. What you're about to hear comes from sources written centuries after these events. The Kulavagga section of the Vinaya Pitaka, the Dipavamsa and Mahavamsa chronicles, later historical accounts. We don't have exact dialogue. What we have is how these communities remembered their own fractures. But we can trace the pattern, and we can see how disagreements over minor rules created entirely different visions of what the Buddha taught. Let's start in that cave, where 500 monks tried to preserve everything. "3 months after the Buddha's death, 500 arahants gather in the Satapani cave at Rajagara. These aren't ordinary monks, these are arahants, monks regarded in the tradition as fully liberated. They've achieved direct realization of the Buddha's teachings, and now they face a deeply human task, preserving a lifetime of teaching entirely from memory. Mahākassapa, the senior disciple, takes charge. The Buddha never appointed a successor, but someone has to lead. King Ajatasattu provides royal patronage for the gathering, and Mahākassapa has the respect of the entire Sangha. He calls forward 2 monks, Ananda, the Buddha's personal attendant for 25 years, the man who heard more teachings than anyone alive. He will recite the suttas, the discourses. Upali, the expert in monastic discipline. He will recite the Vinaya, the rules governing monk behavior. The method is simple. 1 monk recites from memory, 500 others verify from their own memories. If everyone agrees, it becomes official Dharma. If anyone disagrees, they debate until they reach consensus. The cave echoes with constant recitation, months of voices repeating the Buddha's words, verification, debate, refinement, and it almost doesn't happen. Because Ananda, the man who knew the Buddha better than anyone, almost gets excluded. The night before the council begins, Ananda isn't yet an arahant. He hasn't achieved full liberation, and the council is restricted to arahants only. According to the traditional account, Ananda meditates through the entire night. At dawn, literally as the council begins, he achieves awakening and is admitted. The traditional account gives us this scene in sharp outline, even if historians debate the exact details. But then something happens that reveals the real tension underneath. The other monks criticize Ananda publicly. First, he convinced the Buddha to allow women into the Sangha. Many monks see this as compromising the purity of the order. Second, he didn't ask the Buddha which minor rules could be modified after his death. This oversight will become critical. Third, he didn't ask the Buddha to extend his life using supernormal powers. The Buddha had hinted he could live longer. Ananda missed the signal. Consider what this reveals. The man who remembered more of the Buddha's teachings than anyone alive gets put on trial for helping women become monastics. The first council isn't simply about preserving teachings. It's about establishing who has the authority to define what Buddhism means. After months of recitation, the 500 monks reach consensus. The teachings are preserved. Buddhism has survived its founder's death. The Sangha remains relatively unified in the traditional telling. Mahākassapa declares what has been recited together is the Dharma. What has not been recited together is not the Dharma. This seems reasonable, practical, a clear boundary, but they had preserved the teaching, and in doing so they had also drawn a line around what counted as authentic. For about a century, that line holds. The Sangha remains relatively cohesive. Monks travel across India, spreading the same teachings, following the same rules, reciting the same suttas from the collective memory they carried without palm leaf manuscripts, without any written backup. The Pali Canon itself would not be written down until centuries later in Sri Lanka. For generations, it survived only in memory. But Buddhism is spreading, moving into new climates, new cultures, new economic realities. And the Vinaya, the monastic code, was designed for a very specific context. What happens when those conditions change? That question will explode at Vaishali over the most mundane issue imaginable. Vaishali 383 BCE. 100 years after the first council, a wealthy merchant enters a monastery. The heat of the eastern Indian summer presses in. He places a bag of gold coins at a monk's feet. a donation to support the Sangha. The monk smiles, accepts it. An elder monk from another region watches this exchange. His expression darkens. According to the Vinaya recited at the first council, monks cannot touch gold or silver. This rule is explicit in the code, non-negotiable. This monk violated it. Or did he? Over the next century, Buddhism spread far beyond the social world in which the Vinaya had first been recited. Monks now lived in hotter climates, different economies, communities shaped by local customs the early Sangha had never needed to address. The population exploded from thousands of monks to hundreds of thousands. New generations arose who never knew the Buddha, and regional variations developed because the Vinaya, detailed as it is, doesn't cover every possible situation. The monks in Vaishali, called the Vajrayana monks, claim 10 practices are acceptable. The 3 main disputes: storing salt in horns for preservation in hot climates, flexible timing for the noon meal in different regions, and accepting gold and silver donations when refusing them, would potentially alienate crucial support for the Sangha. Plus several other disputed practices around ceremony timing, assembly requirements, and material specifications. The Orthodox monks, elders who trace their lineage back to those who knew the Buddha personally, are horrified. These aren't adaptations, these are violations, the beginning of a slide that, in their eyes, could corrupt the whole tradition. But the Vajrayana monks respond, "We're being practical." The Buddha emphasized adapting skillful means to help people. Our economy requires currency. Our climate requires salt preservation. We're applying wisdom to new contexts. Consider the American Revolution's aftermath. The founders design a democratic system with clear boundaries. Then practical questions arise. Some argue for preserving the original design. Others argue for adaptation to new needs. That's the pattern at Vaishali. Genuine disagreement over how to honor a founding vision when contexts change. But underneath the practical debates, a deeper question. Who has the authority to interpret the Buddha's teachings when the Buddha's instructions don't cover your specific situation? Each side could appeal to the Buddha because the tradition preserved both rules and the expectation of judgment. A senior monk named Yasa visits Vaishali. He witnesses the Vajrayana monks accepting money. He confronts them publicly. "You're violating the Vinaya. This corrupts the Sangha." The Vajrayana monks respond, "You're misunderstanding context. Supporting the Sangha through available economic means serves the Dharma." Yasa refuses to back down. The Vajrayana monks expel him from their monastery. Yasa travels across India, gathering elder monks who share his concern, building a coalition, documenting the violations, and he calls for a council. Not to recite teachings, to put the Vajrayana monks on trial. 700 monks gather at Vaishali for the Second Buddhist Council. This is no longer a shared act of preservation. It is a legal and moral confrontation inside the Sangha itself. Orthodox elders on one side, Vajrayana monks on the other, each convinced they represent the Buddha's true intention. The question on the table, are the 10 Vajrayana practices acceptable? The real question, when traditional rules conflict with practical reality, who decides? Only one side can win. The year is 383 BCE. 700 monks gather in a hall. The debate begins. Orthodox position. The Buddha created the Vinaya for specific reasons. The first council established authenticity. Any modification creates precedent for further change. Today, it's salt. Tomorrow, it's fundamental teachings. Our responsibility is preservation, not innovation. Vajrayana position. The Buddha constantly adapted his teaching to his audience. He gave different instructions to different people. Intelligent application matters more than rigid adherence to rules designed for different conditions. The Dharma will die if it cannot respond to new contexts. Each side presents scriptural evidence. Neither lacks devotion to the Dharma. Both want Buddhism to survive. Each side was responding to a real problem. One feared corruption, the other feared rigidity. The debate continues for weeks. Finally, the council votes. The orthodox position wins. The 10 Vajrayana practices are declared violations of the Vinaya. The Vajrayana monks must cease these practices immediately. The Vajrayana monks refuse. They stand, turn, and walk out. This is the point at which disagreement hardens into lineage. The Vajrayana monks hold their own council, with thousands of supporters. They call themselves the Mahasamgika, the Great Assembly. The Orthodox monks call themselves the Theravada, the Way of the Elders. Two councils, two versions of Buddhism, both claiming the Buddha's authority, both declaring the other mistaken. The Sangha has split. What followed reveals how deep the fracture went. The two groups established separate monasteries, developed separate ordination lineages, competed for royal patronage. For historical context, Christianity experienced a similar fracture in 1517 when Martin Luther challenged the Catholic Church. Luther argued for a return to Scripture alone. The Church claimed authority to interpret it. Each side claimed true Christianity. The split became permanent. The Second Council split created two streams. The conservative Theravada current would eventually feed into what we now call Theravada. Emphasis on the texts recited at the First Council. Strict monasticism, the Arahant ideal. Personal liberation through meditation and discipline. Currents associated with groups like the Mahasamgika helped create space for what later became Mahayana, more flexible interpretation, openness to new teachings, different emphases on practice. Within 200 years, Buddhism would splinter into many more schools, what historians later call the Nikaya traditions. 18 separate lineages, each with slightly different interpretations, each claiming authenticity. 100 years after the Buddha died trying to free people from attachment, his followers fractured into competing traditions over whether you could store salt in a cow horn. And the fracture was just beginning. Because 500 years later, something even more radical would emerge. India, around 100 CE, nearly 500 years after the Buddha's death. The first schism asked who may bend the rules. The next upheaval asked something even more explosive: who may speak in the Buddha's voice? Between the 1st and 5th centuries CE, new scriptures begin circulating across India and beyond. The Astasahasrika Prajnaparamita, the Lotus Sutra, the Heart Sutra. Thousands of pages of new scripture, first in Sanskrit, then spreading across Asia in translation. These texts introduce revolutionary concepts. The Bodhisattva ideal, the practitioner who vows to work for the liberation of all beings, rather than seeking only personal awakening. The Bodhisattva refuses private peace, choosing instead to remain engaged with the suffering world until every being is free. Shunyata, emptiness as the ultimate nature of reality, one famous line from the Heart Sutra. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Buddha nature, the claim that all beings already possess the potential for awakening, and a vast cosmology of countless Buddhas teaching across countless worlds. Communities embracing these texts made a startling claim. The Buddha had taught deeper truths to advanced disciples, profound insights concealed because ordinary practitioners weren't ready. After centuries of practice, humanity was now ready to receive them. This, they claimed, revealed the fuller Dharma. The response from traditional communities was immediate and sharp. These texts appeared centuries after the Buddha's death, no verified chain of oral transmission, no authentication through councils. They contradict core teachings about the nature of awakening and the path. The arahant ideal, individual liberation, is the Buddha's verified teaching. These new scriptures are innovations, perhaps well-meaning, but innovations. Mahayana communities countered, the Buddha taught differently to different audiences. This is documented in the earlier Canon. These scriptures were preserved through separate transmission or revealed through meditative realization. And practically, these teachings produce realization. People achieve awakening through them. That demonstrates authenticity. Neither side convinced the other. By the 5th century CE, what had been one Sangha was now two distinct forms of Buddhism with fundamentally different canons. Same founder, same ultimate goal. Radically different understandings of what the Buddha taught. Then, centuries later, a third vehicle emerged in Tibet and the Himalayas. Vajrayana added tantric methods and made a bold claim. Enlightenment could happen in a single lifetime. We covered that in our video on the 3 schools of Buddhism. 3 vehicles, each claiming authenticity, each disagreeing with the others about what the Buddha taught. But the fragmentation that looked like dissolution became a survival strategy. When Buddhism largely vanished from India between the 12th and 14th centuries, each tradition had already established itself elsewhere. Theravada in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, the story we covered in our Sri Lanka video. Mahayana across East Asia, transforming into forms like Zen, which we explored in our Zen Buddhism video. Vajrayana in Tibet, preserved through lineages that survived even political upheaval. The diversity the councils tried to prevent saved Buddhism from extinction. What one generation called corruption often became the form that survived somewhere else. First came councils. Then came centuries of argument over what those councils had preserved and what they had left out. The first council succeeded in creating collective memory. Buddhism survived its founder's death. The second council failed to maintain unity. It created a permanent split over authority and adaptation. The centuries that followed generated 3 distinct vehicles, each claiming authenticity, each disagreeing with the others about fundamental questions. You might ask, which is right? That question has been argued for 1,700 years. A Theravada scholar will likely tell you the Mahayana sutras aren't the Buddha's actual words. A Mahayana teacher might describe Theravada as preliminary teaching that misses the fuller realization. A Vajrayana practitioner might view both as slower approaches. These doctrinal disagreements persist, but not as hostile divisions. Buddhist communities across traditions largely coexist peacefully in practice. Theravada and Mahayana monastics attend the same conferences. Teachers study each other's texts. The Dalai Lama visits Theravada temples in Thailand. The disagreements are intellectual and historical, not battles over territory or converts. The councils reveal something fundamental about preservation itself. The monks at the first council thought preserving meant creating uniformity. Everyone following identical rules. Everyone reciting identical texts. A tradition can preserve itself so aggressively that it loses the flexibility needed to stay alive in changing circumstances. For about a century, that worked. Then new contexts arrived. Different climates, different economies, different cultural frameworks. And the preserved form couldn't accommodate them without either adaptation or fracture. The Buddha's final instruction, all conditioned things decay, strive on with diligence, didn't specify how future generations should handle this. He refused to appoint a successor or establish a rigid hierarchy. That left interpretation open. And interpretation, when applied to changing contexts, generates diversity. The split was tragic and productive. Tragic because it divided communities who shared the same ultimate goal, created conflicts over legitimacy that persist today. Productive because it ensured survival when any single form would have been vulnerable. Theravada preserved the earliest texts. Mahayana carried Buddhism beyond India. Vajrayana maintained practices through political upheaval. The diversity the councils tried to prevent saved Buddhism from extinction. If you're exploring Buddhism, choosing one path means accepting claims the others reject. Out of these conflicts came the three major vehicles through which Buddhism still understands itself. The councils tried to preserve one teaching. History turned that teaching into several traditions. And those traditions, for all their conflicts, kept Buddhism alive long after it vanished from the land where it began. If you want to understand these traditions in depth, start with our overview of the three schools of Buddhism. In the coming videos, we'll explore each path on its own terms, Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, and the philosophies, practices, and masters that shaped them. Out of these fractures came three paths. Which one do you want to explore first?